All right, in this lecture, we're going to download a dataset from a very popular website called Kaggle.com. Kaggle is basically a place to do data science projects. So the first thing you need to do is to create an account. You can sign up with Facebook, Google, or using a custom email and password. Once you sign up, then come back here on Kaggle.com. Here in the search bar, search for video game sales. This is the name of a very popular dataset that we're going to use in this lecture. So here in this list, you can see the first item with this kind of reddish icon. So let's go with that. As you can see, this dataset includes the sales data for more than 16,000 video games. On this page, you can see the description of various columns in this dataset. We have rank, name, platform, year, and so on. So here's our data source. It's a CSV file called vgsales.csv. As you can see, there are over 16,000 rows and 11 columns in this dataset. Right below that, you can see the first few records of this dataset. So here's our first record. The ranking for this game is 1. It's the Wii Sports game for Wii as the platform, and it was released in year 2006. Now, what I want you to do is to go ahead and download this dataset. And as I told you before, you need to sign in before you can download this. So this will give you a zip file, as you can see here. Here's our CSV file. Now, I want you to put this right next to your Jupyter notebook. On my machine, that is on my desktop. So I'm going to drag and drop this onto the desktop folder. Now, if you look at the desktop, you can see here's my Jupyter Hello World notebook. And right next to that, we have vgsales.csv. With that, we go back to our Jupyter notebook. Let's remove the first line and instead import pandas as PD. With this, we're importing pandas module and renaming it to PD, so we don't have to type pandas dot several times in this code. Now let's type PD dot read underline CSV and pass the name of our CSV file. That is vgsales.csv. Now, because this CSV file is in the current folder right next to our Jupyter notebook, we can easily load it. Otherwise, we'll have to supply the full path to this file. So this returns a data frame object, which is like an Excel spreadsheet. Let me show you. So we store it here, and then we can simply type df to inspect it. So one more time, let's run this program. Here's our data frame with these rows and columns. So we have rank, name, platform, and so on. Now, this data frame object has lots of attributes and methods that we're not going to cover in this tutorial. That's really beyond the scope of what we're going to do. So I leave it up to you to read Pandas documentation or follow other tutorials to learn about Pandas data frames. But in this lecture, I'm going to show you some of the most useful methods and attributes. The first one is shape. So shape, let's run this one more time. So here's the shape of this data set. We have over 16,000 records and 11 columns. Technically, this is a two-dimensional array of 16,011. Okay? Now, you can see here we have another segment for writing code. So we don't have to write all the code in the first segment. So here in the second segment, we can call one of the methods of the data frame, that is df.describe. Now, when we run this program, you can see the output for each segment right next to it. So here's our first segment. Here we have these 3 lines, and this is the output of the last line. Below that, we have our second segment. Here we're calling the describe method. And right below that, we have the output of this segment. So this is the beauty of Jupyter. We can easily visualize our data. Doing this with VS Code and terminal windows is really tedious and clunky. So what is this describe method returning? Basically, it's returning some basic information about each column in this data set. So as you saw earlier, we have columns like rank, year, and so on. These are the columns with numerical values. Now, for each column, we have the count, which is the number of records in that column. You can see our rank column has 16,598 records, whereas the year column has 16,327 records. So this shows that some of our records don't have the value for the year column. We have null values. So in a real data science or machine learning project, we'll have to use some techniques to clean up our data set. One option is to remove the records that don't have a value for the year column, or we can assign them a default value. That really depends on the project. Now, another attribute for each column is mean. So this is the average of all the values. Now, in the case of the rank column, this value doesn't really matter, but look at the year. So the average year for all these video games in our dataset is 2006. And this might be important in the problem we're trying to solve. We also have standard deviation, which is a measure to quantify the amount of variation in our set of values. Below that, we have min. As an example, the minimum value for the year column is 1980. So quite often when we work with a new dataset, we call the describe method to get some basic statistics about our data. Let me show you another useful attribute. So in the next segment, let's type df.values. Let's run this. As you can see, this returns a two-dimensional array. This square bracket indicates the outer array, and the second one represents the inner array. So the first element in our outer array is an array itself. These are the values in this array, which basically represent the first row in our data set. So the video game with ranking 1, which is called Wii Sports. So this was a basic overview of Pandas data frames. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you some of the useful shortcuts of Jupyter.